They said it quietly at first, then openly, then confidently. Africa was never supposed to do this. Not lead, not disrupt, not redefine technology at a global scale. Yet somewhere far from Silicon Valley boardrooms and European research labs, something began to take shape, something that didn't fit the narrative the world had grown comfortable with. This isn't just a story about an invention. It's a story about expectations and what happens when they collapse. For decades, Africa was spoken about as a consumer of innovation, not a creator of it. A place where breakthroughs arrived late, if at all. But while the world was busy repeating that assumption, one inventor was quietly working outside the spotlight, building, testing, failing, refining. His name was Maxwell Chikumbutso, and what he was developing didn't ask for permission. There were no massive launch events, no viral announcements, just small demonstrations that felt wrong. Devices that appeared to run without conventional power sources. Systems that didn't behave the way textbooks said they should. At first, they were dismissed, then questioned, then ignored, because acknowledging them would mean confronting an uncomfortable idea that innovation doesn't belong to a single geography. As Maxwell's work evolved, so did the reactions. Engineers who initially brushed it off began looking closer. Not because of hype, but because the results were repeatable, consistent, calm. That calm was unsettling. Breakthroughs are usually loud, explosive. This one was quiet, almost patient, like it knew it didn't need validation to exist. What made it even harder to ignore was where it was happening. Not in a global tech capital, not backed by legacy institutions, but emerging from a place the world had already decided wasn't supposed to lead. And that's when the tone changed. The question was no longer, what is he building? It became, why didn't we see this coming? Because the truth is, this wasn't a sudden leap. It was the result of years of work done beyond the reach of mainstream attention. A reminder that progress doesn't always announce itself, where people are looking. As demonstrations continued, one thing became clear. This wasn't about catching up. It was about moving differently, solving problems from a completely different starting point. And that difference mattered. Because when you innovate without trying to fit existing systems, you don't just improve them, you bypass them. That realization unsettled more than just skeptics. It challenged the invisible hierarchy of who is allowed to shape the future. And Maxwell didn't argue. He didn't debate. He just kept building. That question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Because once it's asked, it can't be unasked. It forces a shift from curiosity to consequence. As more eyes turned toward Maxwell's work, the conversation quietly changed. It stopped being about whether the technology was real and started becoming about what it represented. Not a single invention, but a signal. A sign that innovation ecosystems were forming in places the world had systematically underestimated. And that made some people uncomfortable. Because global progress has always followed familiar routes. Certain countries lead. Others follow. That order isn't written into physics, it's written into habit. And habits don't like being challenged. Yet the data kept arriving. Systems performing consistently. Demonstrations repeating results without spectacle. No urgency to convince anyone. Just evidence. What stood out most wasn't the technology itself, it was the mindset behind it. Problems were approached from first principles, not inherited assumptions. Instead of asking, how do we make this more efficient? The question became, why does it need to work this way at all? That shift is subtle, but it's where revolutions begin. Because when innovation starts outside dominant frameworks, it doesn't reinforce them. It exposes their limitations. And suddenly, solutions that once felt impossible become obvious in hindsight. Observers began to notice a pattern. Maxwell's work didn't rely on massive infrastructure or fragile supply chains. It was designed to function where resources were limited, where efficiency wasn't a luxury but a necessity. Ironically, that constraint became its strength. Technologies born under pressure tend to be resilient. They don't assume ideal conditions. They expect variability. And when introduced into more resource-rich environments, they don't just survive, they outperform. That realization unsettled experts who had long believed cutting-edge innovation required cutting-edge environments. Because here was proof that necessity, not abundance, might be the better teacher. And slowly, the narrative cracked. The story was no longer Africa catching up. It was Africa approaching problems from angles others had ignored. And Maxwell was just one example. But he was a visible one. A reminder that brilliance doesn't need permission, funding cycles, or global approval to exist. It just needs space to work, which led to an even more uncomfortable realization. That thought lingered because it carried weight far beyond a single inventor. It hinted at a broader shift, one that doesn't announce itself with press releases or trend reports, but unfolds quietly, layer by layer. In many parts of Africa, innovation isn't driven by comfort. It's driven by necessity. Power shortages, infrastructure gaps, limited access to capital. These aren't obstacles to be worked around. They're the starting conditions. And when those conditions shape the design process, the results tend to be fundamentally different. Maxwell's work reflected that reality. It wasn't built to impress investors or dominate headlines. It was built to function, to endure, to operate where conventional systems struggle. And that's what made it difficult to categorize. Because the global tech world is good at spotting familiar patterns. Startups, funding rounds, roadmaps. But this didn't fit neatly into any of them. It evolved outside the usual pipelines, guided by problems that don't show up on balance sheets. As word slowly spread, reactions became polarized. Some dismissed it outright because accepting it would require rethinking deeply held assumptions. Others leaned in quietly, asking careful questions, watching closely, taking notes. Those quiet observers understood something important. You don't learn about the future by looking where everyone else is looking. You find it where the rules are different. And in that sense, Maxwell's work wasn't an anomaly. It was a preview of what happens when innovation is shaped by constraint rather than convenience. When solutions are born from lived experience instead of abstract theory. That's why the implications stretched far beyond technology. They touched economics, education, global influence. Because once the world realizes that breakthrough ideas can come from anywhere, the gatekeeping loses its power. The question stops being where was this built? And becomes does it work? And that question is harder to control. Which may explain why progress like this often arrives quietly. Not because it lacks confidence, but because it doesn't need permission. And as Maxwell continued refining his work, focused more on function than recognition, one truth became impossible to ignore. That realization reframed everything. It wasn't about Africa proving itself to the world. It was about the world finally catching up to what was already happening. For too long, innovation had been measured by proximity to power, who had the biggest labs, the most funding, the loudest voices. But what Maxwell's work quietly demonstrated was that proximity to problems can be just as powerful. Sometimes more. Because when you live with constraints every day, you don't design for perfection. You design for survival. And systems built for survival tend to be elegant, efficient, and resilient. That's why this moment felt different. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't packaged. It simply existed, working as intended. And that kind of confidence doesn't come from hype. It comes from repetition. Observers began to see that this wasn't a single breakthrough moment. It was the visible edge of a deeper process. Years of iteration, learning, and refinement happening far from global attention. And when attention finally arrived, it didn't change the work. That was the most telling detail. There was no sudden pivot to appeal to international audiences. No rebranding to sound more global. No rush to translate the story into something more familiar. The work continued exactly as it had before. Because it wasn't built to be understood immediately. It was built to function over time. And that patience hinted at confidence. The kind that doesn't argue, doesn't explain, and doesn't rush. It simply lets results accumulate until the narrative has no choice but to change. Which brings us back to the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. If Africa can produce breakthroughs without global validation, if innovation can flourish outside traditional centers of power, then the future isn't going to look the way we were taught to expect. It's going to be more distributed, more unpredictable, and harder to control. And perhaps that's the real reason this story matters. Not because of one inventor, not because of one technology. Once that assumption begins to fade, everything built on top of it starts to feel unstable. Funding models, talent pipelines, even the way success is defined. Because if progress no longer flows from a few accepted centers, then influence can no longer be predicted or contained. And that's where this story becomes bigger than Maxwell. Because what his work represents is not an isolated exception, but a pattern waiting to be noticed. Across the continent, innovators are solving problems in ways that don't translate neatly into Western frameworks. Not because they lack sophistication, but because they're optimizing for realities others don't live with. Energy where grids are unreliable. Connectivity where infrastructure is fragile. Efficiency where waste isn't an option. Those conditions don't slow innovation, they sharpen it. And when solutions forged under those pressures begin to surface globally, they don't arrive as imitations. They arrive as alternatives. Entirely different ways of thinking about how systems should work. That's why Maxwell's work triggered such strong reactions. It wasn't just impressive, it was disruptive to the narrative itself. It suggested that the future might be shaped by people who were never meant to shape it. And once that door opens, it doesn't close quietly. Because younger innovators notice. Students notice. Builders who are told to adjust their ambitions suddenly see proof that they don't have to. That permission, real or perceived, is powerful. It creates momentum. And momentum doesn't ask where it's allowed to go. So while the world debates, analyzes, and categorizes what Maxwell has done, something else is already happening beneath the surface. A shift in confidence. A redefinition of what's possible. Africa was never supposed to do this. Not according to the old rules. But the rules were written for a different era. That's what makes this moment impossible to ignore. Not because it arrived with noise or spectacle, but because it arrived without asking. Africa didn't wait for approval. It didn't wait for validation. It simply built. And in doing so, it exposed a truth the world has long avoided, that innovation doesn't belong to a place, a passport, or a pedigree. It belongs to those willing to question assumptions and keep working when no one is watching. Maxwell didn't set out to rewrite a global narrative. He set out to solve problems in front of him. The narrative changed on its own. And that may be the most powerful lesson here. Because when progress emerges from necessity rather than privilege, it carries a different kind of strength. It's not fragile. It doesn't collapse when attention shifts. It keeps moving forward, quietly, relentlessly. This story isn't about Africa proving it belongs in the future. It's about the future realizing it can't ignore Africa anymore. The world once said this wasn't supposed to happen. That leadership would always come from the same places. That innovation had a familiar accent. But history has a habit of correcting itself.